The 8-year-old girl hadn't spoken a single word in 2 years. She hadn't smiled. She hadn't looked anyone in the eye. 12 specialists had tried and failed. A mother with unlimited money had tried and failed. But on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, in a waiting room that smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, a quiet man with scarred hands sat down beside her, said nothing, opened a notebook, and started drawing. And for the first time in 730 days, little Chloe Bennett reached out and touched a stranger's hand. What happened next didn't just change one child. It cracked open 2 broken families and rebuilt them from the ground up. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end, because every part of what you're about to hear matters. If something in this story moves you, press like and drop a comment telling me the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The waiting room at Clearwater Children's Therapy Center was the kind of place that made adults uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite name. It was clean enough. The chairs were padded. Someone had painted cartoon fish along the bottom half of the walls, bright blues and yellows that were clearly meant to feel cheerful. But there was always something underneath the cheerfulness, a tension that parents carried in through the front door and couldn't put down, no matter how hard they tried to look calm for their kids. Ethan Cole had been coming here for 6 weeks with his daughter Mia, and he still hadn't figured out how to feel normal in that room. He sat in the far corner, the one with a clear sight line to the entrance and the hallway both. Old habit, the kind that never fully switched off. He was 37 years old, broad across the shoulders, with hands that didn't quite fit the image of a man sitting in a pastel-colored waiting room. There was a scar along the back of his left forearm that he'd stopped noticing years ago. His jaw carried about 3 days of growth, not because he was making a statement, just because mornings with a 7-year-old were chaotic enough without adding a razor to the equation. I was wearing a gray Henley and dark jeans, and he had a paper cup of coffee from the machine in the hallway that tasted like hot water someone had described coffee to. He drank it anyway. Mia was in with her therapist, Dr. Paulson, for another 40 minutes. Ethan had learned not to sit too close to the therapy corridor. He could hear things through those thin walls sometimes. Not words, just tones. The sound of his daughter working through something. It was harder to wait when he could hear it. So he sat in the corner and looked at nothing. That was when he first noticed the girl. She was sitting against the opposite wall, knees pulled up, arms wrapped around them, making herself as small as she possibly could. She had dark hair and was wearing a yellow rain jacket that was a size too big, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows. She was staring at the floor with the kind of concentration that wasn't really concentration. It was the other thing, the thing that looked like vacancy but was actually the opposite. A person turned entirely inward. A woman Ethan assumed was a nanny or assistant sat about 5 feet away from her, scrolling through her phone with the professional disinterest of someone being paid to be present, but not necessarily engaged. Nobody else in the waiting room was paying the girl any attention. A mother across the room was whispering to her toddler. 2 fathers were both staring at their phones. The receptionist was working through paperwork behind the desk. Ethan looked at the girl. He couldn't have told you exactly what it was that made him keep looking. On the surface, she was just a kid sitting quietly. Parents might have thought, oh, a shy one. Or, she seems fine. Or they might not have thought anything at all and just gone back to their phones. But Ethan had spent years learning how to read what people were actually feeling underneath what they were showing. It was the kind of skill that got drilled into you not in a classroom, but in the field, in high-stress situations where reading someone wrong had real consequences. He'd learned it as a tool. It had become something closer to instinct. And what he was reading off this girl wasn't shyness, it wasn't boredom. It was the particular quality of stillness that people develop when they've decided, somewhere deep down, that the safest thing they can do is take up as little space as possible. When they've learned that being noticed tends to lead to things getting harder, not easier. He'd seen it in grown men. Decorated soldiers who'd been through things that rearranged how they understood the world. Men who sat at the far end of the table at the VA meetings he used to attend, who flinched at loud noises, who laughed a half-second too late at jokes because they were always slightly elsewhere. He wasn't expecting to recognize it in an 8-year-old. But there it was. He finished the last of the terrible coffee and set the cup on the table beside him. Then, moving slowly, the way you move around something that might bolt if startled, he reached into the canvas bag at his feet and pulled out a small spiral notebook. He kept it for Mia mostly, for the time she wanted to draw while they waited. He also kept a pack of colored pencils rubber-banded to the cover. He didn't make a decision exactly. He just stood up and crossed the room in a wide, unhurried arc that didn't point itself directly at her, and sat down on the floor about 6 feet away, his back against the wall, legs stretched out in front of him. Not facing her, parallel. He opened the notebook and started drawing. He wasn't a good artist. He'd never pretended to be. He drew the way a person draws when they're doing it to pass time rather than to produce anything. Loose, slightly lopsided shapes, lines that didn't quite connect where they were supposed to. He started with a dog. Not a realistic dog, just the approximate concept of one. 4 legs, a tail that curled up at the end, ears that were maybe slightly too large for the head. He drew quietly for a couple of minutes. He didn't look at the girl. He wasn't performing patience. He wasn't executing a strategy. He was just sitting with her in the way that he'd learned, slowly, over years that cost him a great deal, was sometimes the only thing that worked. Not talking, not trying, not needing anything back, just being in the same space without pressure. He added a small bird sitting on top of the dog's head. From his peripheral vision, he caught movement. The girl had shifted slightly. Her arms were still around her knees, but she'd raised her head, just fractionally, in his direction. He didn't react. He kept drawing. He added a second dog next to the first one, this one with a slightly more dignified posture and a tiny hat, because Mia would have insisted on the hat. He heard the girl's rain jacket rustle. He looked up, not directly at her, but in her general direction, and gave a short, neutral nod. Then he looked back at the notebook. After another minute, he heard small footsteps. She sat down about 3 feet from him. Not close, not far. She watched his hands without making eye contact with his face. He added a flower in the corner of the drawing. Then he held the notebook slightly to the side so that she could see it better if she wanted to. She leaned forward, just slightly. He turned the notebook toward her and held out one of the colored pencils, a blue one, holding it loosely in the air between them, no expectation attached. A long moment passed. Then, with the deliberate care of someone making a very significant decision, she reached out and took it. She looked at the page for a moment. Then she bent down and, in the upper corner, drew a small, careful sun. 6 rays, evenly spaced. She pressed hard enough that the lines were sure. Ethan looked at the sun. "Good spot for it," he said, quiet, conversational. Then he went back to his drawing. She kept the blue pencil and studied the notebook. Then she added something else, a small figure standing under the dog. A girl, roughly sketched, with long hair and arms at her sides. Neither of them said anything else. They sat there like that for another 10 minutes, adding small things to the drawing, not talking, not performing any particular feeling at each other. The nanny glanced over twice but didn't intervene. The rest of the waiting room continued its business. Ethan had no idea who this girl was. He hadn't been paying attention when she came in, didn't know her name, didn't know what had brought her here. He was just a man waiting for his daughter, sitting on the floor of a children's therapy center, sharing a notebook. That was when the door opened. He heard the click of heels, fast, purposeful, the sound of someone who didn't have a lot of patience for their own schedule. And then a voice, low and controlled, the kind that had learned not to let urgency show. "Chloe." The girl beside him went very still. Ethan looked up. The woman standing near the entrance was 30, maybe 31. She was dressed like someone coming from an important meeting, blazer, dark slacks, hair pulled back. But the composure was working harder than it looked. Her eyes went to the girl first, then to Ethan, and the warmth that had briefly crossed her face when she saw Chloe shifted into something more careful. She crossed the room and crouched down so she was at the girl's level. "Hey, sweetheart, I came as fast as I could." She glanced at Ethan again, the same controlled look, this time with a visible question behind it. "Chloe and I were working on something," Ethan said, nodding toward the notebook. The woman looked at the drawing. Her expression shifted. Something cracked open in it for just a second, something she pulled back quickly. "She was drawing?" she said very quietly. "She added the sun," Ethan said, "and the girl." The woman looked at Chloe. Chloe was still watching the notebook. She hadn't looked up. "I'm Isabella Bennett," the woman said, standing back up and extending her hand to Ethan. Professional reflex. But her voice had changed. It was slightly less polished now, the edge of something real coming through it. Ethan Cole. He shook her hand. I was just waiting for my daughter. Your daughter comes here? 6 weeks now. He paused. Chloe, yours? Isabella looked at her daughter for a moment before she answered. Yes, she said. And then, like she was telling him something she didn't usually say out loud, she hasn't drawn anything in almost 2 years. Ethan looked down at the notebook, at the careful sun in the upper corner, 6 rays, evenly spaced, the small figures standing beneath the dogs. He thought about what it cost to make that mark, how much had to have shifted, even fractionally, for a hand that had stopped reaching to reach again. She just needed someone to sit still, he said. Isabella watched him for a moment. He couldn't tell what she was thinking. She looked like a woman who was very good at not letting people know what she was thinking, and also like someone who was very tired of that being the thing she was good at. She doesn't usually, Isabella started. Then she stopped. She tried again. She doesn't usually let people near her, strangers especially. I know, Ethan said. I wasn't near her. Not really. I just sat down. Isabella looked at him with an expression he recognized. It was the look of someone recalculating, adjusting a picture they'd already formed. She opened her mouth to say something else, and that was when the therapy corridor door opened and Mia came out. Mia was 7, small for her age, with her mother's dark eyes and Ethan's stubborn jaw. She had a piece of paper in one hand and was already talking before she fully cleared the doorway. Dad, Dr. Paulson says I can bring Butterscotch in next time. Well, if he's a comfort animal, he can be a support animal, right? Because he already supports me when I'm sad. She stopped when she saw the woman. Then she looked at the girl on the floor. Hi, Mia said, in the direct, uncalculating way of children who haven't yet learned to hedge. Chloe looked up. It was the first time she'd made direct eye contact with anyone in the room. Mia studied her for a second. Then she sat down on the floor next to her, not asking permission, not making it a big deal, just sitting, and looked at the notebook. Dad put the hat on the dog, Mia said, pointing. He always puts a hat. I don't know why. Chloe looked at the dog with the tiny hat. Something at the corners of her mouth shifted, just barely. Ethan watched his daughter do in 30 seconds what an hour of careful patience had been building toward, and he thought, that's always how it is. You do the slow work, and then someone who hasn't been doing anything at all walks in and tips the thing over the edge. And you don't resent it. You're just grateful something finally tipped. He picked up the notebook and held it out to Chloe. You should keep it, he said. The sun was the best part. Chloe looked at the notebook. She looked at him. Then, with both hands, she took it. Isabella made a small sound. Ethan didn't look at her. He understood the sound, and he understood her need to not have it witnessed directly. He started gathering Mia's bag. We've got to head out, he said to no one in particular. Mia's got a fish at home that needs feeding about 40 minutes ago. His name is Butterscotch, Mia announced to the room. That's a good name for a fish, said the nanny, looking up from her phone for the first time. Ethan stood and helped Mia into her jacket. He was aware of Isabella watching him, and he was aware of Chloe holding the notebook against her chest with both arms the way children hold things they've decided are theirs. As he turned toward the door, Mia paused and looked back at Chloe. You can come next time, Mia said simply. We usually bring crackers. Then she took Ethan's hand and they walked out into the gray afternoon. The rain had eased up to something barely worth calling rain. The parking lot was wet and reflected the streetlights in long, pale streaks. Mia chattered about Butterscotch the whole way to the car. Ethan listened to her and made the right sounds and thought about the sun in the upper corner of the notebook. 6 rays, evenly spaced, pressed hard and sure. He thought about the way Chloe had gone still when Isabella walked in. The way a child who already knows what disappointment feels like braces for it without thinking. He wasn't going to tell himself he'd done anything today. He'd sat on a floor and drawn a bad picture, that was all. He buckled Mia into the back seat and got in and started the car. The wipers moved across the windshield, clearing and blurring and clearing again. He drove home in the rain. He didn't know yet that Isabella Bennett was one of the most powerful technology founders in the country. He didn't know about the 12 specialists, or the 2 years of silence, or the particular weight that money turns into when it can't fix the thing that needs fixing. He just knew what he'd seen in a waiting room, and he knew what that kind of stillness cost a person to carry, because he'd carried it too. Isabella Bennett did not sleep that night. She sat in the chair by Chloe's bed the way she had done on and off for almost 2 years. Not reading, not on her phone, just watching her daughter breathe. The notebook was on the nightstand. Chloe had carried it up herself, held it the entire drive home without saying a word, and placed it beside her pillow before she fell asleep. She hadn't drawn anything else in it. She hadn't spoken, but she'd held on to it, and that was the thing Isabella kept coming back to. She held on to it. In 2 years, Chloe had not voluntarily held on to anything a stranger gave her. She'd returned gifts. She'd left drawings from therapists untouched. She'd once shoved a stuffed animal off a chair that a well-meaning specialist had placed near her. Not violently, just with the flat, final energy of a person who wants to be very clear about something. And tonight she'd gone to sleep with a stranger's notebook pressed against her side. Isabella leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about the man in the waiting room. He hadn't introduced himself. He hadn't explained what he was doing. He hadn't looked at Chloe with that particular expression, the one Isabella had come to dread, that careful clinical attention, the look of someone assembling a case study, that every specialist, every consultant, every well-recommended professional had turned on her daughter like a flashlight aimed at something fragile. He just sat down on the floor and drawn a dog with a hat. That was it. That was the whole thing. And it bothered Isabella in a way she couldn't entirely name, because she had spent an enormous amount of money on people with credentials and offices and framed degrees, and none of them had gotten Chloe to pick up a pencil in 23 months. She told herself it was probably a fluke. A single afternoon, a particular set of circumstances, the randomness of children. She told herself not to build anything on it. She believed none of this, but she told herself anyway, because it was better than the alternative, which was hope. Hope had cost her a great deal over the past 2 years, and she'd gotten very careful about spending it. She went to bed at 2 in the morning and lay there staring at the dark until her alarm went off at 5:30. She had Ethan Cole's contact information by 9 a.m. It wasn't difficult to find. She'd gotten his last name from the receptionist at Clearwater. She knew the woman slightly, had made a donation to the center's equipment fund 6 months ago. And from his last name and the therapy center's general patient demographic, her assistant had his basic professional profile within the hour. Security consultant, independent, based in Millhaven, former military. The military part had caught her assistant's attention. He'd flagged it in the summary with a small note, Naval Special Warfare background. Isabella read that line 3 times. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Something more ordinary, maybe. She'd built a picture of him in her mind overnight. A quiet man, maybe a social worker of some kind. Someone trained in child psychology or developmental therapy. The kind of person who ended up in that specific waiting room because that was the world he moved through professionally. Naval Special Warfare was a different picture entirely. She sat with that for a while, trying to refit the man she'd seen. The gray Henley, the paper coffee cup, the unhurried way he'd sat down on the floor, into that context. It was strange how well it worked, actually, once she tried. The way he'd moved through the room, the specific quality of his stillness, the fact that he hadn't flinched or overreacted when Chloe reached toward him, just absorbed the moment without making it into one. She called him at 9:15, and he picked up on the 3rd ring. Cole. His voice was the same as yesterday, direct, not unfriendly. Mr. Cole, this is Isabella Bennett. We met yesterday at Clearwater. She paused. My daughter Chloe. I remember, he said. The son. The simplicity of it stopped her for half a second. Yes, she said. The son. She collected herself. I wanted to call because Chloe slept with the notebook last night. She hasn't. That's not something she normally does. I wanted to tell you because I thought you should know your kindness was Ms. Bennett. He wasn't rude. He just stopped her before she could finish building the sentence. You're not calling just to tell me that. She closed her eyes briefly. No, she said. I'm not. There was a short silence. My daughter has an appointment at Clearwater again on Thursday, he said. I'll be in the waiting room around 2. Would it be all right if I brought Chloe? Another pause, shorter this time. That's not really my call. I know. I'm asking anyway. She heard something in the background, a child's voice, distant, Mia probably, saying something that sounded like a question about a fish. Then Ethan's voice away from the phone. Lid's on the tank, Mia. He's not going anywhere. Then back to her. Thursday's fine. Thank you, Isabella said. Don't thank me yet, he said, and hung up. She sat looking at her phone for a moment, then she put it down and went back to work, which was the thing she always did, because it was the one domain where she still trusted herself completely. Thursday came cold and clear, one of those late autumn days that felt like the season had finally committed. Isabella picked Chloe up from her current school program, an adaptive learning environment, small class sizes, designed for children with various emotional and developmental challenges, the fourth school they'd tried, and drove to Clearwater without explaining where they were going. She'd learned not to give Chloe advance notice. Anticipation ran in the wrong direction with her. The more time she had to prepare for something, the more the anxiety built, until by the time the event arrived, she was so braced for whatever it was that she couldn't experience it at all. So Isabella just drove, and they listened to the radio, and Chloe looked out the window at the stripped trees going past. When they pulled into the Clearwater lot, Chloe went still. Isabella watched her in the rearview mirror. She couldn't tell what Chloe was feeling. She'd spent 2 years trying to learn how to read her daughter again, the version of her daughter that existed now, and she was still terrible at it. Chloe's face had learned to give very little away. Another thing she'd had to grieve. "We're just stopping in for a bit," Isabella said. "You don't have to do anything." Chloe looked at the building, then she unclipped her seatbelt and reached for the door handle, and Isabella understood that was as much of an answer as she was going to get. Ethan was already there when they came in. He was in the same corner, this time with a cup of coffee that looked equally bad, and a slightly larger notebook. Mia was sitting beside him with her own notebook, drawing something complicated that involved multiple colors and a great deal of concentration. Mia looked up when they came in. "Hi," she said, the same way she'd said it on Tuesday. No fanfare, no performance, just acknowledgement. Chloe stopped inside the doorway. Ethan looked up, gave Isabella a short nod, and then looked at Chloe. He didn't say anything. He just held up the new notebook, showed her the cover, which he'd drawn on. A dog. Familiar, slightly lopsided, with a hat. Something moved in Chloe's face. She crossed the room and sat down on the floor. Not 6 feet away? 3. Isabella sat in one of the padded chairs nearby and tried to look like she was reading something on her phone. She was not reading anything on her phone. Over the next 40 minutes, she watched Ethan Cole do something she couldn't entirely explain, even as it happened in front of her. He didn't follow a program. He didn't use therapeutic language or structured prompts. He didn't treat Chloe like a project to be solved. He talked to her the way you talk to a person when you're both doing something else. The conversation beside the activity, low stakes, oblique, the kind that's easy to participate in because it doesn't ask for much. He told her, at one point, about a dog he'd had as a kid. A beagle named Cartwright, who had been, by any objective measure, the dumbest animal he'd ever encountered, and who had nonetheless managed to open the refrigerator on 3 separate occasions and eat an entire cooked chicken each time. Chloe was watching him sideways while he talked, her pencil moving on the page. "How do you open it?" Mia asked, not looking up from her own drawing. "Honestly, we never figured it out," Ethan said. "We'd watch him, and he'd just sit there looking innocent. The second we left the room..." He made a sound. "Chicken." Mia shook her head with the solemn authority of a child who found this deeply relatable. Chloe, still not looking directly at him, made a very small sound. Isabella wasn't even sure what to call it. Not a laugh, not quite, but something adjacent. Something in the neighborhood. Isabella looked down at her phone screen so that she wouldn't make a face that would ruin everything. She and Ethan didn't talk until they were both getting up to leave, the girls heading toward the exit together. Mia telling Chloe something about butterscotch, with the particular urgency of someone who believes the person they're talking to will find this information as important as they do. "Does she talk?" Ethan asked. "Quiet, not pointed." "She used to," Isabella said. "Before." She didn't elaborate on the before. She never did with strangers. The doctors call it selective mutism, but it's a category, not an explanation. She can speak. She stopped. "Stop trusting it," Ethan said. Isabella looked at him. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly it." He nodded slowly, like someone filing information rather than reacting to it. "Can I ask you something?" Isabella said. "Go ahead." "Your background, military." His expression didn't change exactly, but something in it settled, the way a face does when a person decides how much to confirm. "Yeah," Naval Special Warfare. A pause. You ran a background check. I ran a professional summary, she said. I do it with everyone. She meant it as information, not apology. He seemed to take it that way. Yeah, he said again. SEAL, 8 years. And now you're a security consultant. Keeps the hours flexible. He glanced toward the exit, where Mia was now demonstrating something to Chloe with her arms outstretched, some kind of wingspan measurement. Kid needs a parent who's actually around. Isabella watched the girls. Your daughter's therapy, she said carefully. Is it? She lost her mother, Ethan said. 2 years ago. So. He said it without self-pity or performance, just laid it out there, a fact among other facts. She's doing okay, better than okay most of the time, but we come here. I'm sorry, Isabella said. He shrugged with one shoulder, not dismissing the condolence, just not knowing what else to do with it. She understood that. You have a way with Chloe, she said. I want you to know that I don't say that easily. I've sat through a lot of sessions with a lot of people who are very credentialed and very expensive. What you did in there isn't something I've seen before. He looked uncomfortable. Not falsely modest, actually uncomfortable. Like praise was a texture he found unpleasant. I just sat down, he said. That's what I mean, she said. He thought about that for a moment. The girls had pushed through the front door and were standing on the front step in the cold air. Mia's voice carried back in, something about a fish. What happened to Chloe? He asked. If you don't mind me asking. Isabella was quiet for a moment. She'd told the story enough times that she'd developed a clinical version of it, something she could deliver without it costing her too much. She used that version now. When Chloe was 6, we had a car accident. I was driving. A driver ran a red light and hit us on the passenger side, where Chloe was sitting. She paused. She wasn't seriously injured physically. A broken wrist, some lacerations. Nothing permanent, but she was trapped in the vehicle for almost 40 minutes before the first responders could get her out. Alone. I was unconscious. She stopped there. Ethan was listening in the way he listened, fully, without filling the space. She was calling for me the entire time, Isabella said. Or she did at first, and then she stopped. She looked toward the exit. When she stopped calling, everyone thought she'd passed out. She hadn't. She just stopped. A beat of silence. By the time I came around in the ambulance, she was already changed. The doctors kept saying it was acute trauma response, that children recover, that she'd come back to herself. She drew a careful breath. It's been 2 years. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, she was alone for 40 minutes and no one came. Yes. And now she doesn't trust that calling for someone will work. Isabella turned to look at him. He wasn't saying it to demonstrate insight. He was saying it the way you say something when you recognize it. That's what her therapist believes. Yes, she said. Makes sense, he said simply. She waited. I've seen it, he said. Not in kids, in other contexts. He didn't go further into that, and she didn't push. The mechanism's the same. Person reaches out, nothing comes. They reach out again, nothing. At some point, the brain does the math and decides reaching out is the thing that's costing them, not the problem itself. So they stop. And how do you fix it? She asked. She heard the word fix and wanted to take it back. It wasn't the right word, but he didn't react to it. You don't fix it, he said. You just show up enough times that the math changes. Isabella looked at him for a long moment. She had a very good instinct for people. It had kept her alive in a business environment that had eaten a lot of people whole. And her instinct about Ethan Cole was that he was someone who said less than he knew and meant more than he said. I'd like to ask you something, she said, and I want you to know before I do that I understand you can say no and it changes nothing. He waited. I'd like to pay you to spend time with Chloe, she said. Not as a therapist, not in any formal capacity, just the way you have been, 2 or 3 times a week, somewhere comfortable, maybe outside when the weather holds. I'll compensate you fairly and we'll work around Mia's schedule. The silence after that was longer than any of the previous ones. I'm not a therapist, he said. I know that. I don't have any training in child psychology. I know that too. I'm just a guy who sits on floors. I know, she said, and that's exactly why I'm asking. He looked out the door at the girls. Mia had apparently found something on the ground, a leaf, or a rock, and was showing it to Chloe with great seriousness. Chloe was looking at whatever it was with focused attention, which for Chloe was a kind of engagement. Isabella watched him watching them. She'd learned, sitting across boardroom tables from people who were trying to get something from her, how to tell when someone was calculating and when someone was genuinely uncertain. Ethan was genuinely uncertain. I wasn't playing a negotiation. He was working something out. I'd have to think about it, he said finally. Of course. I don't want to. I'm not trying to be another disappointment for her. She drew a son, Isabella said quietly. Ethan. She used his first name without thinking and didn't course correct. She drew a son. She hasn't touched a pencil in almost 2 years. He was quiet. I'm not promising you anything about Chloe, she said. I'm not telling you this will work. I've had too many people promise me things about Chloe. She paused. I'm just telling you what I saw. He looked at her, and for just a moment the controlled, neutral expression opened slightly, the way a door opens when someone on the other side finally turns the handle. I'll call you, he said. He called her the next morning at 7:15. She was on her second coffee, already at her desk, looking at quarterly projections that needed her attention and getting very little of it accomplished. Okay, he said when she picked up. That was it? Just okay? No preamble, no negotiation, no conditions attached in the first breath. Okay, she said. Weekday mornings work best for me, and I want Mia involved when possible. It seems like they're good for each other. They are, she said. She'd been watching that too, the way her daughter tracked Mia without fear, the way Mia talked to Chloe the same way she talked to everyone, without adjusting her energy or her expectations downward, which turned out to be exactly what Chloe needed. And I'm not going to report back to you after every session, he said. I'm not a consultant producing deliverables. If something significant happens, I'll tell you. Otherwise, I'd rather you just let me work. Agreed, she said without hesitation. A pause. You agreed to that very fast. I've been micromanaging this situation for 2 years, she said. It hasn't helped. Something in the quality of his silence shifted. Not surprise exactly. More like recalibration. Okay, he said again. Monday morning then. He hung up before she could say anything else. Isabella put the phone down and looked at the quarterly projections. She thought about a girl sleeping with a notebook pressed against her side. She thought about a man who described himself as a guy who sits on floors, and who somehow had more real instinct for what her daughter needed than anyone she'd hired with actual credentials. She thought about what it might mean for a child who had stopped calling out into silence to slowly learn that some silences could be sat with. She allowed herself carefully the small and fragile things she'd been keeping out. She let herself hope. Just a little, just enough. She'd been wrong before. She knew that. She'd built on smaller things than this and watched them come to nothing. And she'd done that particular kind of grieving that doesn't have a name because it's not for a loss that happened once, but for a loss that keeps happening, keeps asking you to hand over the same thing. She knew all of that. But she also knew what she'd seen in that waiting room. And she knew what she'd seen on her daughter's face. Fractional, barely visible, but there. When Ethan held up a notebook with a dog on the cover. She pulled the quarterly projections back toward her and tried to work. She got through about 4 lines before she gave up and sat very still in her expensive chair, in her expensive office, holding a feeling she didn't know yet whether she could afford, and deciding, because it was the only decision she had left, to hold it anyway. Monday came with a sky the color of old pewter and a wind that had made up its mind about something unpleasant. Ethan showed up at 8:50 with Mia and 2 paper bags from the diner 3 blocks from their apartment, eggs and toast for the girls, coffee for the adults, a small container of orange juice that Mia had insisted on because she was going through a phase of believing orange juice cured everything. I wasn't sure how Isabella felt about diner food arriving at her front door, but he wasn't going to show up empty-handed, and he wasn't going to pretend the coffee from places like this wasn't better than whatever a machine in her kitchen produced. The house was not what he'd expected, which was his own fault for expecting anything. He'd looked up Isabella Bennett the night before, enough to understand the scale of what she'd built, the kind of company profile that showed up in the first 3 search results, the net worth estimates that financial publications threw around, and he'd braced himself for something that announced all of that at the front door. Gates, probably. A driveway long enough to think about things. Instead, it was a house on a quiet street in a good neighborhood, large but not aggressively so, with a front yard that had an actual lawn and a porch with a wooden swing that needed repainting. There was a clay pot by the front door with a dead plant in it that nobody had gotten around to removing yet. He appreciated that detail in a way he couldn't have explained. He rang the bell and heard footsteps, and then Isabella opened the door. She was in dark slacks and a light sweater, hair down for the first time. She looked slightly more like a person and slightly less like a press photo of herself. She looked at the paper bags. "You brought food." "Eggs get cold fast," he said. "We should probably move." She stepped back to let them in. The inside was warm and smelled like coffee already brewing, which he appreciated. The rooms were comfortable, real furniture that had been lived in, a bookshelf that showed actual reading rather than decoration, a low table in the living room that had Chloe's art supplies spread across it, and an arrangement that suggested regular use. That detail stopped him for a second. He filed it without comment. Chloe was sitting at the end of the couch in a sweater that was clearly her favorite based on how worn it was at the cuffs. She was watching them come in with the particular alertness she had, that way of tracking without appearing to track. When Mia walked past Isabella and dropped herself onto the other end of the couch as if she'd been doing it for years, Chloe's shoulders dropped about half an inch. "Your fish okay?" Mia asked, pulling her own notebook out of her bag. Chloe looked at her, then she held up 2 fingers. Mia nodded seriously. "2 is good. 3's too many. Dad has a theory about fish." "It's not a theory," Ethan said, setting the bags on the kitchen counter. "It's an observation." "What's the observation?" Isabella asked, pulling mugs from a cabinet. "More than 2 fish in a tank and they start having politics," he said. Mia pointed at him from across the room. "See? Theory." From the couch, a sound. Small, brief, but distinct. Ethan did not react. He busied himself with the coffee cups. Beside him, he heard Isabella set a mug down carefully, the sound of someone controlling the impulse to turn around. Chloe had laughed. Not fully, not openly, just the outline of one, the shape of something that had been under a lot of pressure for a long time, and found a hairline crack to move through. That was how the first Monday went. They built a routine over the following weeks, the way you build most things that actually last. Not by planning them too carefully, but by accident and repetition and small adjustments. Tuesdays and Thursdays, Ethan and Mia came in the morning. Sometimes they brought food, sometimes they didn't, depending on what the morning had been. They stayed 2 hours, sometimes 3 when the conversation ran somewhere interesting, and nobody looked at a clock. Ethan didn't structure the time. He didn't bring activities or plans. He showed up the way he would show up to spend time with a person he liked, and he treated Chloe accordingly. As a person he liked, whose communication happened to take a different shape than most people's. He learned things about her gradually, the way you learn things about anyone you spend time with. She was precise. When she drew, she measured proportions in her head before she committed a line to paper, and she was bothered when something came out wrong in a way she didn't bother to hide. She'd flip back to a page she'd worked on before and study it with a dissatisfied expression, and Ethan thought, "Yeah, I understand that, the gap between what you intended and what you actually produced. That particular specific frustration." She was also funny in a way that was still emerging. Not verbally, not yet, but in small physical ways. The dry, exact timing of a look, the way she'd position a drawing to make a point that was sharper than anything she'd have said out loud. One Thursday, she produced a sketch of what was clearly meant to be Ethan attempting to draw. The figure in the picture had one hand on the page and the most defeated expression she could render, and showed it to Mia without showing it to him first. Mia had made a sound like she was trying not to choke. "Can I see?" he'd said. Chloe had considered this, then turned the notebook to show him. He'd looked at it for a moment. The figure really was accurate in its hopelessness. "I don't look like that," he said. Chloe had tilted her head in a way that meant, "You absolutely do." "You're tough," he told her. She'd pulled the notebook back and added a small detail to the figure, a paper cup of bad coffee in one hand. "Okay," he said. "Fair." These were the increments. They didn't feel like progress in the moment, which was the point, because the moment you started measuring progress, you started putting pressure on it, and pressure was the thing that had been applied to Chloe for 2 years with diminishing returns. So Ethan didn't measure. He just showed up, which turned out to be its own kind of discipline. the discipline of not needing something to happen. He'd learned that discipline the hard way. Not from any book or program. From the kind of situations where you waited for long stretches in conditions that would try the patience of anyone, where the habit of needing something to happen could get you killed because it made you move when you should have stayed still. He'd learned to be comfortable in the waiting, and so they waited together, him and Chloe, in their particular way. And slowly, incrementally, the distance between them, not physical distance, but the other kind, the kind that gets built out of caution and disappointment, shortened. Whoa. Isabella watched most of this from the middle distance. She'd agreed to Ethan's terms. Let me work. Don't debrief me. Don't manage this. And she meant to honor them. But she was a person who had built a company from a two-person operation to a workforce of 1,200 by being acutely attentive to everything happening around her, and asking her not to pay attention was like asking someone to turn off a sense they'd been developing for 15 years. So she was present, but carefully so. She worked at the kitchen table during sessions, or moved through the back part of the house where she could hear but not hover. She resisted the pull to come into the living room and check how things were going. She resisted it the same way she'd had to resist calling specialists in the middle of the night in the early months, when the urge to do something, anything, to fix what was happening to Chloe had been almost unbearable. The one morning she did walk through, she'd needed something from the bookshelf and told herself it couldn't wait, which was not entirely honest. She caught a moment she hadn't been prepared for. Ethan was sitting on the floor beside the coffee table, which he'd taken to doing naturally, as if chairs were a formality he'd agreed to participate in elsewhere, but saw no need for here. Chloe was sitting beside him, close enough that their arms were nearly touching. They were both looking at something in the notebook, a drawing Chloe had been working on across 3 sessions now, something elaborate and difficult that she kept returning to. Ethan was saying, quietly, "The line here is fighting you because you're holding the pencil too tight. Your hands brace like you're expecting something to go wrong." Chloe looked at him sidelong. "Here." He held out his hand, palm up. She put the pencil in it. He held it between 2 fingers, loose. "Like this. You're not trying to control where it goes, you're just suggesting." He handed it back. She looked at the pencil for a moment. Then she adjusted her grip and bent back over the page. Ethan watched, elbows on his knees, and said nothing else. Isabella reached the bookshelf without making noise, found what she hadn't actually needed, and went back to the kitchen. She stood at the counter and looked out the window at the dead plant on the porch that she still hadn't thrown away, and felt something loosen in the middle of her chest, the way something does when it's been wound tight for a very long time and finally finds a direction to unwind into. She didn't go back through the living room. It was Mia who told her what Ethan never would have. It happened on a Thursday afternoon in November, about 5 weeks in, when Ethan had stepped outside to take a work call. Something to do with a client site assessment, logistics that he'd said would take 15 minutes. Isabella was in the kitchen, Chloe had gone upstairs to get a different pencil, and Mia was sitting at the kitchen table eating a cracker with the focused satisfaction of someone who considers a cracker a complete experience. "Your daughter is getting better," Mia announced. Isabella looked up from her laptop. "I think so too." "Dad's good at that," Mia said, "making people better." She was very matter-of-fact about it. "He did it for me when Mom died. He never told me what to feel. He just stayed there." Isabella set her coffee cup down. Mia broke the cracker in half and studied both pieces. "He cried, though. At the beginning. I heard him at night sometimes. He didn't know I could hear." She looked up. "I think it was better that I did, because then I knew it was okay to be sad. Even for him." Isabella didn't say anything. She understood that this was one of those moments that closed up if you tried to put a hand into it. "He misses her," Mia said. "Mom, but not the way that makes everything stop. He told me once that missing someone and going forward at the same time was, he used a word I didn't know. Coherent? No." She thought, concurrent. He said they could be concurrent. "That's a good word," Isabella said. "He says a lot of good words." Mia finished the cracker. "But only when he's explaining something important. The rest of the time he mostly says normal things." She looked at the cracker box. "Can I have another one?" "Of course." Mia reached into the box. "I like your house. It has good corners." "Good corners," Isabella repeated. "Places where you feel okay sitting. Our apartment has good corners too." Dad's house was different before. After Mom died, he changed the furniture around. I think he was trying to find new corners. Isabella looked at this 7-year-old child who spoke like someone much older, but said it all in the cadence of someone who hadn't yet learned that what she was saying was remarkable. Did you find them? Isabella asked. New corners? Yeah, Mia said. This is one. She held up the cracker. Food helps. Isabella laughed. It came out of her before she had a chance to shape it or decide whether it was appropriate. A real laugh, warm and startled, and Mia grinned at it the way children grin when they've produced an effect they weren't quite trying for. The moment that changed things happened on a Wednesday, which wasn't even one of their scheduled days. It had been Mia's idea. She'd asked Ethan in the particular way she asked for things, not demanding, just laying the request out matter-of-factly and trusting it would be considered, whether they could go to the park because she wanted to show Chloe the big oak tree by the east entrance that had a branch perfect for sitting on. Ethan had checked the weather, found it acceptable, and called Isabella, who had said yes before he finished the sentence. The park was mostly empty on a Wednesday morning in mid-November. The sky was the flat, bright white of a day that couldn't decide about itself. Their breath showed in the air. The girls went ahead. Mia moved with her usual self-directed energy. She'd spotted the tree from 50 yards and was making for it with the intentionality of a person who has a specific goal. Chloe walked beside her, slightly behind, with her hands in her jacket pockets and her eyes moving over everything. Ethan and Isabella walked behind them at the natural distance that opens up when two adults are following children and not trying to close it. Can I ask you something? Isabella said. Seems to be your opener, he said. I've been told I lead with questions. She watched the girls. Your service. The people you lost. You told me once that you understood what Chloe was carrying because you'd carried it. I've been thinking about that. He walked for a moment before answering. What have you been thinking? I've been thinking that you've never told me what actually happened, and I've been thinking that I don't have the right to ask. She paused. But I'm asking anyway. I was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. The girls had reached the oak tree. Mia was already testing the low branch with both hands. Last deployment, he said finally. I was team leader, 6 guys on an extraction, pulling a contractor out of a situation that had gone sideways in ways we hadn't been briefed on. It was supposed to be 4 hours. He stopped. It ran 3 days. And at the end of 3 days, I brought 4 of my 6 guys home. Isabella said nothing. 2 didn't make it back, he said. Hardin and Kowalski. Dave Hardin had a daughter. Kowalski was engaged, wedding was 3 months out. He said the names with the steadiness of someone who'd said them many times privately and learned that the only way to say them out loud was to let them be plain. I made decisions over those 3 days. Some of them I'd make the same way again. Some of them, I don't know. You don't get to find out. That's the part that stays. Ahead of them, Mia had gotten onto the branch and was helping Chloe find the right place to put her foot. I left after that, Ethan said. Not immediately. I stayed through the process, the debrief, there's a whole institutional mechanism for this, and I went through all of it. But I left. He paused. Julia was sick by then. My wife. She'd been sick for a while, and I'd been not there. So I came home, and I was there for the end of it, and then she was gone, and then it was just me and Mia. He said it all in the same register. Matter of fact. Not cold. Just the voice of someone who'd processed enough of this to be able to move through it without stopping. And I had a choice about what to do with everything I was carrying. I could put it somewhere and let it sit there, or I could figure out if any of it was still useful. And Chloe, Isabella said, Chloe's the clearest version of something I understand. He looked at the girls in the tree. Mia had gotten herself into the good sitting position and was explaining something about load distribution with the confidence of a person who had recently made this her area of expertise. Chloe was up on the branch now, both hands holding, and her face was open. The shuttered quality was still there at the edges, but the center of it had cracked into something that wasn't quite wonder, but was in that direction. I know what it feels like to stop trusting that calling out will do any good. And I know that the only thing that actually reaches it is time, and someone who shows up and doesn't need anything back. Isabella looked at him. He turned and looked at her at the same time, the way it happens sometimes, both people arriving at the same moment without planning it. His eyes were a particular gray-green that she'd noticed before and told herself she was noting for no specific reason. "You did that for your team," she said. "After difficult operations. You helped them recover." "Tried to." "It's not a small thing," she said. He looked away, back toward the tree, the same discomfort with being seen directly that she'd noticed the first time. "It was just being a person," he said. "Some people aren't," she said. "Just being a person. Some people are performing being a person, and there's a difference, and most of us can't articulate it, but we can all feel it." She paused. "Chloe feels it. She always has. Even before the accident, she was perceptive about people, about who was actually present and who was going through motions." She looked at her daughter in the tree. She stopped reaching because reaching kept finding nothing. "You're the first person she's reached toward in 2 years. I think it's because you're actually there." He didn't say anything to that, but he didn't argue it either. In the 3rd week of December, the first full sentence came. It came the way the important things tend to come, sideways, when nobody was braced for it, when the moment was ordinary enough that there was no particular weight attached. They were in the kitchen. Ethan was attempting to help Mia make a grilled cheese, which required more supervision than it should have because Mia had developed an independent theory about butter distribution that Ethan disagreed with professionally. Chloe was sitting at the table watching this with the expression she used for things she found quietly entertaining. Isabella was nearby, leaning against the counter with coffee, trying not to direct the butter situation. The argument about butter reached a natural pause. And into the pause from the table, Chloe said, "She's right about the butter." It came out clear, a little rough at the edges, the voice of someone who hadn't used it much, like a hinge that needed use to move freely again. But clear. A complete thought. Subject, verb, object. Nobody said anything for approximately 1 full second. Then Mia pointed at Chloe with her spatula. "See?" she said to Ethan. "I told you." Ethan looked at Chloe. Chloe looked back at him with an expression that was dangerously close to smug. 2 against 1, he said. Chloe gave a small, precise nod. "The butter argument was a setup," he said. Her expression didn't change, but something in it deepened. Isabella had turned to face the window because she didn't trust her face. The backyard was bare and brown, and the light was coming through flat and pale, and she stood there looking at it and felt something move through her chest that she didn't have the right name for. Not relief exactly, not happiness exactly, something more specific than both. The feeling of a thing you'd stopped believing in arriving anyway, in a kitchen, over a butter argument, on a Wednesday morning in December. She heard Mia say, "You can say more stuff, whenever." And Chloe said, in that careful voice finding its way back into the air, "I know." "Cool," Mia said, and flipped the grilled cheese. Ethan looked at Isabella's back. He saw the set of her shoulders, and he understood precisely what was happening, and he didn't say anything, and he turned back to the stove, and he told Mia that technically she'd flipped it too early, which was not true, but which was the right thing to do in that moment, and Mia argued about it, and the kitchen filled back up with noise. Isabella got herself together by the time she turned around. Her eyes were dry. She was a person who had developed very good control of herself over many years, but her hands, when she set the coffee cup down, were not entirely steady, and she saw Ethan clock it without looking directly at her, the small peripheral awareness he had of everything in a room, and she understood that he'd seen it and was letting her have the privacy of pretending he hadn't. She was grateful for that, more than she would have expected. The weeks that followed were not a straight line. Nothing real ever is. Chloe spoke, and then she didn't speak for 3 days, and Isabella held her breath through all 3 of those days, and tried not to assign meaning to the silence the way she had trained herself not to do. Then on the 4th day, Chloe came downstairs and asked for orange juice. Mia's influence, clearly, she'd developed a similar conviction about it, and said it plainly, easily, like it wasn't a thing. It went like that. Words returned not in a flood, but the way warmth returns to a cold room, gradually and unevenly, some corners warming faster than others, some stubborn patches of cold that would hold until they were ready to let go. She started talking to Mia first, which made sense. Mia was easy to talk to because she didn't react to what Chloe said any differently than she reacted to everything else. With direct, equal-weighted engagement, no special register for the significance of it. She treated Chloe's voice like she'd always had it, which was the greatest possible gift. She talked to Ethan next, and those conversations were different, slower, more careful, chosen words rather than impulsive ones. She'd think before she spoke in a way that made Ethan understand she was deciding whether a thing was worth putting into the world. He respected the rigor of that. He operated the same way, mostly. She didn't talk much to Isabella yet. Not because she'd retreated from her. If anything, she was more physically present with her mother, closer in rooms, more willing to stay near. But the talking was still working its way back through whatever it had to work through. Isabella understood. She didn't push. She just stayed close, in the careful way she'd learned, and waited for it. It came, but not quite yet. The last week of December brought snow, the first real snow of the season, and Mia reacted to it with the absolute conviction that this was a significant occasion requiring everyone's full participation. She recruited Chloe within approximately 90 seconds of arriving, and they went out into the backyard. And Ethan stood at the back door with his coffee and watched his daughter teach Chloe the specific aerodynamics of a good snowball, which mostly involved Mia throwing several bad ones and analyzing them critically until she arrived at a technique she was satisfied with. Chloe tried one. It held together. It went where she aimed it, which was a tree 6 feet away. "That's good," Mia said, in the serious tones of a person who knows what she's looking at. Chloe looked at the tree. Then she turned and threw the second one directly at Ethan. It caught him in the shoulder. He looked at her. She looked back at him with an expression that was completely innocent and entirely guilty at the same time. Mia covered her mouth with both hands. "You're going to want to run," Ethan said. Both girls ran. He went after them, and the yard filled with noise, and Isabella came out onto the back step in her coat and watched the three of them move through the cold air, and she laughed again. The real kind, the kind that was becoming more available to her lately, finding its way back the same way her daughter's voice was, through the same patient, inexplicable process of showing up and being allowed. She went in and made hot chocolate, because it was the only thing she could think of that felt like the right response to a moment like that one. Ethan came in last, brushing snow off his shoulder, and looked at the 4 mugs on the counter. He looked at her. She handed him one. "She threw it at you on purpose," Isabella said. "I know," he said. "She's been planning that for about 3 sessions." He looked surprised. "You think?" "She had the angle," Isabella said. "She was waiting." He looked out the window at the yard where the girls were making something in the snow. An ambitious project, unclear of category, requiring extensive discussion between them. Then he looked back at Isabella. Something moved between them in the quiet kitchen. Not a decision, not yet. Something that was still taking shape, still finding out what it was. Both of them were practical enough, and had been through enough to know not to name it before it was ready. "Good," he said finally, about Chloe and the planned snowball. He almost smiled. She's learning to trust her aim. Isabella wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at him, and she thought, yes, that's exactly it. That's what all of this has been. Learning to trust the aim. Learning that when you reach toward something, your hand might actually find it. She was starting to think that lesson applied to more than one person in this house. January came in hard. 3 days after the new year, a cold front pushed down from the north and settled over Millhaven like it had decided to stay permanently. The temperature dropped into the low teens overnight, and the snow that had seemed charming in late December turned gray and compacted along the edges of roads and sidewalks. Ugly in the way that only snow can get when it's overstayed its welcome. Ethan ran in it anyway. He always ran in the mornings, 6 o'clock regardless of weather, a habit from the military that had survived everything else that hadn't. 3 miles, same route, the loop through the park, and back down Aldermore Street and around. He'd stopped timing himself years ago. The point wasn't performance anymore. The point was the 28 minutes where his mind could move without needing to produce anything. He thought about a lot of things on those runs. He thought about Mia, the small logistics of her life, the things she'd said the day before, the things she was working through in therapy that Dr. Paulson updated him on in their monthly parent sessions. He thought about work, the security consulting jobs that kept the money functional, if not excessive, a background noise of professional obligation that he managed efficiently without caring about very much. Started to notice, he thought about the house on Greystone Lane with the dead plant by the front door that was still there, still unreplaced, and had become for him a kind of landmark. He didn't examine this too carefully. Ethan Cole had a long history of not examining things until they demanded examination, which was either a flaw or a survival strategy depending on the context, and he was aware it was probably both. What he knew, running through the gray January cold, was that the situation had shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way he could point to and date, but something between the beginning of November and now had changed its shape, and he was living inside the new shape without having fully mapped it yet. He finished the run, showered, got Mia fed and her bag assembled, listened to her theory about why butterscotch was smarter than average, which now included the fish successfully predicting bad weather by swimming in circles, and drove her to school. On the way back, he stopped at the diner and got coffee and sat in the window booth for a while and looked at the gray street and let himself think about it plainly. He had a problem, which was that Ethan Cole was a man who had spent the last 2 years becoming very good at not needing anything. Not in the self-pitying sense. He didn't walk around feeling deprived. He had Mia and work and a life that functioned, and he wasn't lonely in the dramatic way because he didn't give loneliness much room. He just contracted, focused on what was essential and let the rest go quiet. It was efficient. It worked. And now it wasn't working, in the specific way things stop working when something you didn't budget for starts taking up space. He drank the coffee and thought about Isabella's hands on the mug, the way she'd handed him the hot chocolate in December, and the expression she'd had in the moment after, not guarded, not performing, just present, in the rare way she was sometimes present when she stopped managing herself for a few seconds. He thought about Mia saying, in the kitchen 3 weeks ago while he was outside, "I like your house. It has good corners." He knew what that meant. He'd thought about it more than made sense. He paid for the coffee and drove home and called a client about a site assessment and worked through the morning and didn't resolve anything, which he'd known he wouldn't, and drove to pick Mia up from school at 3 and listened to her talk about a disagreement she'd had with a classmate about the proper pronunciation of the word particularly. And he gave his opinion when asked and noticed that the thing in his chest that he'd been declining to name had not gone anywhere while he was busy ignoring it. He called Isabella that evening. It was 7:30. He knew Chloe would be in the wind-down part of her night. They'd gotten into that routine. He knew the evening schedule from the mornings, the shape of the household. She picked up on the second ring. "Ethan, I need to tell you something," he said, "about my service. There's more to what I told you in the park, and I think you should know it, given everything." He stopped, bothered by the phrase "given everything" because it was imprecise, and he didn't like being imprecise when it mattered. "Given that you've trusted me with Chloe, you should have the full picture." A pause. "Okay," she said. "Not on the phone," he said. "Can you do Saturday morning? I'll get someone to watch the girls." "Yes," she said, simply. 9 o'clock. There's a diner on Caldwell Street." "I know it." "Okay," he said. And then, because he didn't have anything else planned, he said goodnight and hung up, and sat for a moment in the chair in his living room where Mia had already gone to bed, the apartment quiet around him, and thought about what he'd just committed to and whether he was prepared for it. He wasn't, particularly. But he'd learned a long time ago that prepared was a condition you aimed at and rarely fully reached, and that waiting until you got there was its own kind of failure. But Saturday. Mia went to her friend Dara's house with considerable enthusiasm and a bag that contained, among other things, 3 drawings she wanted Dara's opinion on and the latest report on Butterscotch's weather-predicting abilities. Ethan dropped her off, drove to Caldwell Street, and found a booth in the back of the diner where he could see the door. Old habit. Isabella came in at 9:02, which he'd already clocked as her pattern. Close to time, never quite on it, the 2 minutes of a person whose life ran slightly ahead of the schedule she set. She was in a dark coat and scarf, her hair down, and she looked around the room before she saw him with the same assessing sweep he used, which he'd noticed before, the habit of someone who'd learned to read rooms. She slid into the booth across from him. A waitress appeared. They ordered coffee and eggs neither of them were particularly hungry for, and then Isabella folded her hands on the table and waited. Ethan started, because he'd asked her here. "I told you about Hardin and Kowalski," he said. "The last deployment. 2 men I brought home in bags." "Yes." "I didn't tell you the thing that came before that," he said. 3 months before that mission, I made a recommendation that put our team in that theater to begin with. There was an intel assessment, Credible, sourced, the kind of thing you act on. I advocated for it. I pushed command to approve the operation. He looked at his coffee. The intel had a hole in it, not visible from where I was standing at the time, or that's what I've told myself, but I've had 4 years to examine that, and I'm still not 100% sure I looked as hard as I should have. Isabella said nothing. She was watching him the way she watched important things, completely. The mission ran long because the situation on the ground was more complex than the intel suggested. And in the additional time we didn't expect to need, we lost Hardin and Kowalski. He said it flat and plain. My recommendation put us there. My push to action contributed to the conditions. And I have spent a very specific amount of time thinking about whether I could have looked harder at that intelligence assessment and found what was missing. What's the conclusion? She said. I don't know, he said. I genuinely don't. That's the honest answer. Command cleared me. The review process cleared me. The decisions I made during the 3 days in the field were sound, given what we had. But the question I can't fully close is what we should have had, and whether I was rigorous enough about demanding it before we moved. He paused. I wanted you to know that, because you trust me with your daughter, and I want you to be clear on who you're trusting. Isabella looked at him for a long moment. Outside, someone walked past the window with a dog that had a plaid coat on, and the ordinariness of it was almost funny against the specific weight of the booth. You think this disqualifies you somehow, she said. I think you should have the full information. Ethan. She said his name in the way she occasionally did, the tone that meant she was about to say something she'd thought through and was committing to. I have made bad calls. I have pushed initiatives that weren't ready because I was certain and moving fast and didn't stop to examine what I was missing. 2 years ago I was driving when I should have asked the driver to take Chloe and me. The meeting I was rushing from was not worth what it cost. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not drawing a parallel to minimize what you went through. I'm saying that I don't make decisions about people based on whether they've made mistakes. I make them based on what I can see about how a person carries their mistakes. He looked up. The way you carry it, she said, is that it made you more careful, more honest with yourself, more present with the people you're responsible for. She paused. That's what I can see. He looked at her across the table and felt something move in his chest. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind of feeling. More like a held thing, slowly letting go. The feeling of a door that you've been leaning against for a long time, and someone pushes gently from the other side, not forcing it, just making it clear the other side is there. I'm not easy to be around, he said. It came out direct, without the packaging he might have put around it if he'd planned the sentence. I run early and I talk in short sentences and I don't say what I'm thinking most of the time, and I've never been particularly good at the version of myself that socializes without a purpose. Isabella looked at him steadily. I'm aware, she said. I'm not notably better. I've been told I approach human relationships the way I approach quarterly reviews. She paused. I'm working on it. He almost smiled. Who told you that? My VP of Operations. It was a performance review. We reversed roles for about 90 seconds, and she decided to use them. Her expression had something in it that wasn't quite rueful, but was in that neighborhood. She was correct. The food came. They ate for a while without talking, which was fine, easy, in the specific way that quiet is easy with certain people, when the silence doesn't require maintenance. There's something else I want to tell you, he said, when the plates were mostly cleared. Not a confession, just something I've been thinking about, and I'm going to say it once, and I don't need you to respond to it today. Isabella set down her coffee cup. I think what I've been around in this situation with Chloe has included you. And I'm aware that started as a professional arrangement, and I'm aware what that means in terms of how you should read anything I'm saying. He stopped, restarted. I'm not a person who says things like this, so I'm saying it badly, but I wanted to be honest about it rather than let it sit there where you can't see it, because I've been in enough situations where the thing nobody named became the problem. Isabella was quiet for a long moment. She looked at her coffee. Then she looked out the window. Then she looked back at him. You said you didn't need me to respond today, she said. I don't. Okay, she said. And then carefully, but I want to say one thing. She waited until he met her eyes. I hear you. That was all. 3 words, and she meant all of them, and he understood that she did, and that was enough for now, which was the only unit of time that had ever really made sense to him. What Ethan didn't know, in the days that followed, was that Isabella had been conducting her own kind of reckoning. It lived alongside her regular life, the board meetings, the product reviews, the operational calls that started at 7 a.m. and sometimes ran past 8 at night. She was good at compartmentalizing. She'd built the compartmentalization deliberately, back in the years when she was building everything else. Because a founder who can't hold competing things in separate boxes tends to collapse under the weight of all of them simultaneously. But what she was working through wouldn't stay in a box. It kept arriving in the middle of other things. She was in a meeting about a product launch, and she was thinking about what Ethan had said. The thing nobody named became the problem. She was reviewing a contract, and she was thinking about the way he sat on the floor next to Chloe, the specific patience of it, the fact that he'd chosen the floor over the furniture every single time without making a statement about it. She'd had relationships since Chloe's father, who had exited the situation when Chloe was 4, calmly and decisively, the way he did everything, and who now lived in another city with a new family and sent birthday cards and had become, over time, someone Isabella thought about less and less. She'd had 2 relationships after that, one that had run for about 8 months and ended by mutual exhaustion, one that had ended after 3 months when the man in question made it gently clear that he wasn't prepared for the reality of Chloe's needs. Both of them had tried. She didn't hold it against either. The reality of Chloe's needs had not been an easy thing to be proximate to in the years before Ethan. Before Ethan. She noticed that she was using that phrase internally as a periodizing marker, the way you mark time by what changes things. And she sat with what that meant for a moment in the back of a car between meetings one afternoon, the city moving past the window, and let herself look at it plainly. He was not straightforward. He communicated in compressed, irregular bursts that required unpacking. He had a soldier's instinct for emotional concealment that coexisted, uneasily and imperfectly, with a genuine capacity for care that he expressed through action rather than language. He made bad coffee a non-negotiable part of any morning, and he apparently had strong opinions about fish. He was also the first person she'd met in years who was more interested in what was true than in what was comfortable, which was something she'd spent a long time looking for in the people she kept close and finding, at best, partially. She called her friend Renata on a Thursday night, which she did rarely enough that Renata answered with, "Who died?" "Nobody," Isabella said. "I need to talk." "That's alarming," Renata said. "Hold on, I'm putting the kids to bed. 5 minutes." It was 11 minutes, but Renata came back with a glass of wine and the full attention she was good at when she was willing to deploy it. Isabella told her about Ethan, not the whole arc from the beginning, just enough for context, and then what he'd said at the diner. Renata was quiet for a moment. "He told you he was interested while also saying he didn't need you to respond." "Yes." "And you said you heard him." "Yes." "Isabella." Renata's voice had the fond exasperation of a 15-year friendship. "I have never known you to be indirect about anything in your professional life." "My professional life is easier," Isabella said. "Why?" "Because the stakes are financial," Isabella said. "Money is recoverable." A beat of silence on the line. "Chloe's doing better?" Renata asked. Yes, she asked me this morning whether we could get a dog." Isabella paused. "She asked me." A full sentence, unprompted. "And?" "I said I'd think about it," Isabella said. And she said, in this completely dry voice, "Think fast, because Mia's already researching breeds." She stopped. "She made a joke, Renata. My daughter made a joke." Renata was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was gentler. "And Ethan Cole was the one who did that." "Yes." "Then you already know what you think," Renata said. "You called me because you wanted someone to tell you it was all right to think it." Isabella didn't say anything. "It's all right to think it," Renata said. "It's all right to feel things, Isabella. Not everything is a risk profile." "Most things are," Isabella said, but without the certainty she would have had a year ago. The conversation that cracked everything open happened on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of January, and it didn't involve Ethan or Isabella at all. It involved Chloe and a woman named Dr. Sylvia Park, who had been Chloe's therapist at Clearwater since the beginning, and who had been, across 2 years, one of the few constants Isabella genuinely trusted. Dr. Park had watched Chloe's progress over the past months with the measured, evidence-based encouragement of a clinician who'd seen enough false dawns not to celebrate prematurely. But in January, she'd asked to meet with Isabella separately, which she hadn't done in over 6 months. Isabella sat across from her in the Clearwater office and waited. "Chloe talked to me this week," Dr. Park said, "more than she has in 2 years by a significant margin. I want to tell you about some of what she said, with her permission. She asked me to." "Okay," Isabella said. "She talked about Ethan," Dr. Park said, "specifically about what's different with him. She consulted her notes, not reading verbatim, just grounding herself. She said, 'He doesn't want me to be okay for him. He just wants me to be.'" She paused. She thought out how to say that for a while, apparently. Those were the words she chose. Isabella looked at the wall behind Dr. Park's head for a moment. "She also said something about you," Dr. Park continued. "She said she can see that you're trying. She said, and again her words, that you've always been trying, and she knows that, and she's sorry she couldn't always tell you." Dr. Park set the notes down. "It took her several minutes to say that part. I don't want you to think it came easily, but she wanted you to know it." Isabella's eyes were dry because she'd decided they would be, and she sat with that for exactly the length of time she could manage it. And then she said, in a voice that was nearly steady, Is there something I should say to her?" "She's not expecting anything," Dr. Park said. "She just wanted you to know." She didn't tell Ethan about that session directly, but 2 days later, on a Thursday morning, she pulled him aside while the girls were in the backyard, a rare sunny January day that they were treating as a meteorological event requiring immediate outdoor participation, and told him what Dr. Park had said. She told him Chloe's words, "He doesn't want me to be okay for him. He just wants me to be." Ethan listened without moving. "I wanted you to know," Isabella said. "Not as a report, not as a milestone. You should know what your presence has meant to her. The specific thing." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Mia's voice carried through the glass, something urgent and project-related, clearly requiring Chloe's full engineering input. "She figured that out herself," he said finally. "I didn't try to teach her that." "I know," Isabella said. "That's what I mean." He looked at her. The morning light came through the kitchen window at an angle that was unflattering in the way real light is. Shadows in the wrong places, ordinary. And Isabella noticed that she'd stopped seeing him in any calculated way, stopped assessing, stopped trying to construct a complete picture. She just saw him, which was either progress or a different kind of vulnerability, and she'd decided it didn't matter which. "The foundation," she said. "I want to talk to you about something, an idea I've been developing." She'd been working on it for 3 weeks, quietly, in the margins of her regular work. The way she developed things she was serious about, slowly first, letting the concept find its structure, then faster once the structure was solid. "I want to start a foundation, not a charity, a working organization, focused on children navigating emotional trauma and the adults responsible for them. I've been talking to people who know this space, and there's a significant gap in the kind of support that exists, the practical, in-the-room kind. Not just clinical frameworks." He was listening. "I want to offer you a role leading the program development side of it," she said. "Not a ceremonial role, a real one, with real authority over how the work gets done and who does it." She paused. "I want your particular way of approaching this to be the thing we build around. Not because of your military background, because of what you did with Chloe, and why it worked, and the fact that I think you understand something about human recovery that most professionally trained people I've met don't." He looked at her steadily. "I want to pay you appropriately," she said. "I want it to be flexible enough to work around your life, Mia, your consulting work, whatever the logistics require. And I want your honest assessment of the idea first. If you think it's wrong-headed, I want you to tell me." A pause. "What kind of scale are you thinking?" he said. "Initially regional, Millhaven and the surrounding counties. 3 to 5 years to build something that can be replicated." She'd done the numbers. She was someone who always did the numbers. "I can fund the startup costs through the company's social investment arm. If it works, we look at external funding." He thought about it. She watched him think about it. The visible processing that she'd learned was how his mind worked. Genuinely, not performatively. He wasn't playing reluctant. He was actually working through it. There are people who've done this work longer than me, he said. Yes. I'd want them involved. I'd expect it. And I'm not a figurehead, he said. I won't do it if it's about putting a Navy SEAL on the letterhead. I know, she said. That's not what this is. How do you know? You haven't built it yet. Because I'm building it around you, she said. Not around what you were, around what you do and why it works. Those are different things. She met his eyes. You told me in the park that you turned your pain into something useful. I'm asking you to make that the structure of something bigger. He looked out the window for a moment. The girls had moved to the far end of the yard and appeared to be examining something in the frozen ground, a discovery of significance, clearly, requiring crouching and pointing. What you said at the diner, he said, not looking at her yet. About hearing me. Yes. I've been thinking about that. So have I, she said. Now he looked at her. I'm not good at the thing people expect, he said. In terms of, I don't do it the way most people do. I don't either, she said. I approach relationships like quarterly reviews, apparently. The corner of his mouth moved. Who told you that? Someone who was right. She paused. I think two people who are bad at this in their own specific ways have a reasonable chance of being bad at it together and arriving somewhere decent anyway. He looked at her for a long moment. The foundation, he said. I'll do it. On the conditions I said. Agreed, she said. And the other thing. He said it carefully. The way he said things he'd decided mattered. I'd like to take you somewhere. Not with the girls. Just. He stopped. Tried again. Dinner or something that isn't this, which is not, I value this, but it's not. Yes, she said, saving him from the sentence which had done its job anyway. Yes. Something shifted in his face. Not a transformation, nothing dramatic. Just the small, specific change of a person who has said a difficult thing and had it received. Saturday, he said. Saturday, she said. From the backyard, Mia's voice came through the glass. Dad, Chloe found something. We think it might be a fossil. It's probably a rock, he called back. It could be both, Mia called. Chloe's voice came next, smaller, but clear enough to carry. I looked it up. Rocks can be fossils. Ethan looked at Isabella. She looked back at him. And between them, in the ordinary kitchen light, something that had been forming for months completed its shape. Not a resolution exactly, not anything wrapped up or finished, but a direction. A shared one, arrived at by two people who were both, in their own imperfect and hard-won ways, learning to trust what they reached toward. Outside, in the frozen January yard, Chloe held up the rock that might be a fossil and turned it in her hands, studying it from every angle. The way she studied things she decided were worth understanding. Mia said, Do you think it's old? Chloe considered the question seriously. Everything important is, she said. Saturday dinner turned out to be a small Italian place on Mercer Street that Ethan had driven past 100 times without going into, the kind of restaurant that doesn't advertise because it doesn't need to, with 8 tables and handwritten menus and a proprietor who greeted people at the door like he genuinely meant it. Ethan had asked Mia's school friend Dara's mother, a practical woman named Carol who had been doing him small logistical favors since the girls became inseparable, to take Mia for the evening. He told Mia he was going to dinner. Mia had looked at him with the particular expression she used when she was processing information she considered significant, and then she'd said, With Isabella? And when he said yes, she'd nodded slowly, with the solemnity of someone ratifying a decision they've already made privately, and gone to pack her overnight bag. He didn't know what to do with that, so he didn't do anything with it. Isabella had arranged for her regular sitter to stay with Chloe. She'd told Chloe where she was going with the same policies she'd developed for most things. Plain and direct, no hedging. Chloe had listened. Then she'd asked, Does he know where to park on Mercer? It's bad on Saturdays. Isabella had stared at her daughter for a moment. I'll tell him. Good, Chloe said, and went back to her drawing. So Ethan had parked 2 blocks over, on Aldine Street, which had been fine. And they'd eaten pasta and talked for 3 hours in the way that happens when two people who are each, in their separate ways, economical with words suddenly find themselves in a context where there's no particular reason to be economical. They talked about Mia's evolving theories about animal intelligence. They talked about the company Isabella had built and the specific sequence of decisions in the first 2 years that she'd never talked about publicly because they involved a level of controlled desperation that didn't fit neatly into the founder mythology. They talked about what Ethan's life had looked like between leaving the military and arriving in Mill Haven, the 16 months of doing not much and not looking at it too carefully, which had been necessary, and also the loneliest he'd ever been. They didn't talk about what they were doing. That seemed, by mutual unspoken agreement, like a question that would answer itself in time. He walked her to her car afterward. It was cold and clear, the kind of January night where the stars are sharp and the air has teeth. She turned to him on the sidewalk, and there was a moment, the particular beat that happens when two people have been moving toward something and have arrived at the place where it either happens or doesn't. He kissed her. Brief, not tentative, but not excessive. And when he pulled back, she was looking at him with an expression that was entirely unguarded, the one she had when she'd stopped managing herself, and she said, "You took long enough." "I wanted to be sure," he said. "And?" "I'm sure," he said. She drove home, and he walked back to his car and sat in it for a minute in the cold, engine off, looking at the street, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, something quieter than that, the specific feeling of a person who has been carrying a weight for a long time, and has just, without quite noticing when it happened, set it down. He drove home. The apartment was quiet without Mia. He went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept without the interrupted, vigilant half-sleep that had followed him home from the service and mostly stayed. He slept through, straight, and woke up to the gray February morning with the very ordinary and previously unavailable feeling that the day ahead of him was something he was looking forward to. February into March into April, and the world softened by degrees. The foundation took shape the way serious work takes shape, not quickly, not cleanly, with setbacks and wrong turns that had to be backed out of and redirected. Ethan spent the first month in meetings he hadn't anticipated needing, with lawyers and nonprofit consultants and people who understood the regulatory landscape of operating a program that would work directly with children. He sat through these meetings with the focused patience he applied to everything that mattered, asked the questions he needed to ask without apologizing for not already knowing the answers, and filed the information in the organized, accessible way his mind had always worked when the task in front of him was real. Isabella was there for the structural decisions and let him run the program ones, which was what she'd promised and what she delivered. She had opinions. She always had opinions, and she gave them when asked and sometimes when not asked, and they disagreed about the intake process in the third week and had a conversation about it that lasted 40 minutes and was uncomfortable in the direct, productive way that disagreements between people who respect each other tend to be. Ethan's position prevailed because his argument was better. He'd expected her to concede with difficulty. She conceded cleanly, which meant she'd actually been persuaded rather than managed, and he understood something about her from that, the distinction between her ego and her judgment that confirmed something he'd already suspected. He hired carefully. A part-time clinical coordinator named Dr. Wendy Solis, who came from a child trauma background and who had the rare quality of being both technically rigorous and genuinely warm. The two things that usually split between different people. A program assistant named Marcus, who was 24 and relentlessly organized and had a younger sister with anxiety who'd been underserved by available resources, which was the kind of personal motive Ethan trusted more than the abstract professional kind. They started small. 6 families in the first cohort, all referred through Clearwater and 2 other area therapy centers, all involving children for whom the existing clinical resources were necessary but not sufficient. The model was simple, which was the whole point. Ethan had spent enough time around systems that complicated themselves until they couldn't function to be militant about simplicity. A consistent adult presence, low pressure, regular contact, activity-based engagement that gave kids something to do together while the actual work happened sideways, the way it always did, the way it had happened with Chloe in a waiting room over a notebook. Trauma, Ethan had come to believe through experience rather than theory, didn't respond to being addressed directly as often as it responded to being quietly outflanked. You didn't go at the wall, you found the door. He talked to families on the first visits himself, always. He explained what they were doing and wasn't overpromising about it. He told them, "This isn't a cure and I can't give you a timeline. And if anyone tells you they have both of those things, be skeptical. What I can tell you is that we'll show up consistently, we'll pay attention, and we'll adjust to your kid rather than asking your kid to adjust to a program. Some of the parents looked relieved by that. Some of them looked uncertain. A few of them cried, which he handled with the same practical steadiness he handled most things, because he understood that crying was not a request for intervention, it was just a pressure valve opening, and the most useful thing you could do for it was be present without making it a problem to solve. Mia came to the foundation's small offices twice a week after school. Ethan hadn't planned for this, but hadn't prevented it either, and it turned out she had a gift for walking into a room with an unfamiliar child and finding the immediate common ground, the shared interest, the thing they could do together in the next 10 minutes. She was 8 years old, and she was better at it than half the adults he knew. He didn't tell her this in those exact terms because he didn't want her to become self-conscious about it. He just thanked her, specifically, for specific things she'd done, and watched her absorb the feedback with the seriousness she applied to things that mattered to her chum. Chloe's recovery was not a straight line either, and this is worth saying plainly because straight lines are what people hope for and what they rarely get, and the gap between the hope and the reality can undo more progress than the difficulty itself. There were days in February when she went quiet again, the old silence, and Isabella would find her sitting in the window seat in her room with her knees up, looking at the yard, not drawing, not reading, just somewhere interior. On those days, Isabella had learned, slowly, at some cost to her instinct to act, to simply knock, ask if she wanted company, and accept either answer without making it mean more than it did. Sometimes Chloe said yes. Isabella would bring tea and sit in the chair near the window, and they'd be in the room together without performing anything, just two people in proximity, which turned out to be what Chloe sometimes needed more than any particular kind of engagement. Once, on a gray February afternoon, Chloe said, not looking at her, looking at the yard, "I was so loud for so long in the car, and nothing came, and then I just stopped." Isabella kept very still. "I knew you were there," Chloe said. "I knew you weren't. I knew it wasn't your fault. I understood that. But knowing didn't stop it from changing something." "I know," Isabella said. "I know it didn't." "I don't blame you," Chloe said. "I want you to know that." Isabella's voice, when she found it, was not entirely steady. "Thank you," she said. "I'm not sure I've known that, not all the way down. Thank you for saying it." Chloe looked at her then, directly, with the clear dark eyes that had always seen more than she let on. "You kept coming," she said. "Even when I couldn't tell you it was helping. You kept coming." "Of course I did," Isabella said. "Not everyone does," Chloe said, and that was true, and they both knew it was true, and there wasn't anything to add to it. They drank their tea. The gray afternoon moved through the window and the yard was still and brown, and eventually Chloe picked up her sketchbook and began drawing, and Isabella sat nearby and read her book. And that was the afternoon, ordinary and sufficient and more than enough. Spring arrived the way it does in that part of the country, reluctantly, in stages, the cold releasing its grip 1 degree at a time over 3 weeks. Until one morning, you walk outside and the air is different, genuinely different, and you realize winter has finally given up its argument. Mia noticed it before anyone else, which was on brand. "It smells like the park," she announced at breakfast in the first week of April, with the authority of someone reporting a scientific finding. "Can we go this weekend? All of us?" All of us had become a phrase with a specific meaning in the last 2 months. It meant Ethan and Mia and Isabella and Chloe, the configuration that had assembled itself through winter and which none of them had named formally, because naming it would have required deciding what to call it, and none of the available words were exactly right yet. They were something. The something was real and recognized by all 4 of them. The word for it was still finding its way. They went to the park on Saturday. It was different from the November day in every visible way. The trees had started greening, people were spread out on the grass with books and dogs, and the particular loosened energy of people who've survived something and emerged on the other side. The oak tree by the east entrance had its leaves coming in, the branch where Chloe had sat in November now framed in new growth. The girls went ahead, same as always, the same reliable dynamic. Mia moved with direction, Chloe moved with attention, taking in the park the way she took in everything she'd decided was worth understanding, thoroughly, at her own pace. Ethan and Isabella walked behind them in the easy, unhurried way they'd developed, close enough that their arms occasionally touched, which neither of them moved away from. Dr. Solis gave me the 3-month report on the first cohort, Isabella said. I read it. It's good. It's a start, he said, which is all 3 months can be. 4 of the 6 families want to continue. The other 2 are transitioning to other resources, which means the model worked for them. They got to where they could use standard channels. That's the goal, he said. We're not trying to be the permanent answer. We're trying to be the thing that gets people to where permanent answers exist. She nodded. The board approved the expansion budget. I know, Marcus told me. He paused. We're going to need another clinical coordinator. Wendy can't carry the load at twice the cohort size. I have 2 candidates. I want to interview them. I assumed, she said, without any edge in it, just the acknowledgement that she'd long since stopped expecting otherwise. They walked for a while without talking. Ahead, the girls had reached the oak tree. Mia was looking at the new leaves with scientific interest. Chloe had her sketchbook out. She brought it everywhere now, a different notebook than the original, which had been filled months ago and lived on her nightstand, and was looking up at the tree with the considering expression she used before she decided something was worth drawing. Can I tell you something? Ethan said. Usually follows that I can, Isabella said. He almost smiled. The first morning I went to Clearwater with Mia. I almost didn't take her there. There was a different practice closer to the apartment. I'd done the research on both, Doctor. Paulson had slightly better reviews. It was worth the extra distance. But that morning I was tired, and it was raining, and I stood in the kitchen for about 30 seconds, thinking about whether the closer one was good enough. Isabella looked at him. I went to Clearwater because Paulson's reviews were better, he said. That's it. That's the whole thing. He paused, and a kid I'd never seen before was sitting in the corner. Isabella thought about the weight of that, the 30-second kitchen calculation, the rain. I think about that kind of thing, he said, the specific smallness of the hinge that a whole direction turns on. Does it bother you? No, he said, and meant it. It's just true and worth knowing that the thing you're grateful for most often came through a door you almost didn't go through. He looked at the girls in the tree. Mia almost convinced me to get a fish the previous month. I said no because I knew I'd end up as its primary caregiver. She found a logical flaw in that argument, and we revisited the question. Butterscotch is the reason you went to Clearwater? Isabella said. Butterscotch's existence is contingent on a series of negotiations that went about 6 rounds, he said. So, tangentially, Isabella laughed, the real kind, the one that had become more available to her over the winter the way warmth becomes available again in spring, not all at once, but steadily, until one day you realize the cold isn't the default anymore. I almost put Chloe in a different program, she said, after her 4th therapist. There was a residential program in Connecticut, highly regarded, specialist who'd worked with trauma for decades. I visited it. She paused. I almost signed the papers. It was a good program. It probably would have helped her, eventually. She looked at her daughter in the tree, but it was 2 hours away and I would have seen her on weekends, and I kept thinking about the accident, about how she was alone for 40 minutes and I wasn't there. I couldn't make myself put her somewhere I wasn't. She was quiet for a moment. So I didn't, and 6 weeks later she was in a waiting room at Clearwater. Ethan said nothing for a moment. He thought about the weight of the decision she'd described, the kind of decision that has no clean answer, where every option has a cost, and you choose by process of elimination among imperfect things and live with the uncertainty of what the other choice might have done. He'd made those decisions in different contexts. He knew what they felt like in the body. You made the right call, he said. I don't know that, she said. I do, he said. Not because it led here, because you made it for the right reason. She looked at him. He was looking at the tree where both girls were now sitting on the branch together, Chloe sketching, Mia identifying cloud shapes aloud for an audience that was only partially listening. You're better at forgiving yourself than I am, Isabella said. No, he said. I'm just further along in the process. He paused. It doesn't finish. You just get more practiced at carrying it without letting it run things. The evening of the small celebration, this is what they called it afterward because celebration had seemed presumptuous at the time, and small had seemed like the honest scale, happened on a Friday in early May. It wasn't planned as a significant occasion. Ethan and Mia had come for dinner, which had become a regular enough event that it no longer required planning, just confirmation. Isabella had made pasta, which she'd become competent at over the winter through what she described as applied stubbornness and what Mia described as the scientific method. And Chloe had set the table with the particular thoroughness she brought to tasks she'd decided were worth doing correctly. They ate. Mia told a story about a disagreement at school that had somehow escalated to involve the entire class taking sides over the correct way to fold a paper airplane, a story that grew in complexity and geopolitical stakes with each sentence until Chloe, who had been listening with increasing visible amusement, said, "Did you win?" "Technically, the whole class won because we all got to test them," Mia said, "but my design flew the farthest, so—" "So yes," Chloe said. "So yes," Mia confirmed. After dinner, the girls disappeared upstairs, which they did most evenings now, gravitating to Chloe's room where they'd established a specific ecology of activities: drawing, the meticulous tracking of Mia's ongoing research into dog breeds, a shared construction project involving cardboard that had been in progress for 3 weeks and whose ultimate purpose was still unclear even to its architects. Ethan was washing the dishes. He'd assumed this task without being asked 3 months ago, and it had simply become his. And Isabella was making coffee at the counter, and the kitchen was quiet with the specific comfortable quiet of a place where 2 people have spent enough time to have stopped needing to fill it. Then Chloe came downstairs. She came in quietly and stood at the edge of the kitchen with something in her hands, a piece of paper, folded carefully. Ethan turned off the tap. Isabella turned from the counter. Chloe crossed the kitchen and held the paper out to Ethan. He dried his hands and took it and unfolded it. It was a drawing. She'd done it in colored pencil, carefully. Ethan could see the precision in it, the measured proportions, the deliberate placement. 4 figures standing together. Not schematic the way a young child's figures are, but detailed, individual. You could tell who they were from the specific details she'd included. A tall one with short hair and a gray shirt. A smaller one with her arms spread to a wingspan she'd always maintained was aerodynamically significant. A woman with her hair down, standing straight in the way she stood. And herself, the 4th figure, a little apart from the others still but connected. Her hand extended toward the tall figure, touching his sleeve. Underneath, in her careful, even handwriting, "Thank you for finding me." Ethan looked at the drawing for a moment. He was not, by nature or by training, a person who displayed emotion in company. He'd worked hard over many years to develop the capacity to experience significant things without the experience registering on his face, because there had been a long stretch of his life when that capacity was necessary for the safety of people around him. The habit had stayed long after the necessity for it, but standing in Isabella's kitchen on a Friday evening in May, looking at a drawing made by a girl who had not spoken or reached or drawn for 2 years before a rainy afternoon in a waiting room, he felt his throat tighten in the involuntary way that bypasses everything you've trained. He folded the paper carefully along its original creases. He looked at Chloe. "Thank you," he said. His voice came out even. Nearly. Chloe looked at him with her clear, direct eyes, the eyes that had always seen more than they let on, that had seen him across a waiting room when most people in that room saw nothing of note, that had decided, over a terrible paper cup of coffee and a bad drawing of a dog with a hat, that maybe there was something in the room worth seeing. "You sat down," she said, simply. "I did," he said. "Nobody else did," she said. Not with bitterness. Just as a fact, examined and understood and filed under things that are true about the world that you can either let define you or not. "No," he said. "I know." She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned and went back upstairs, and they heard the door of her room open and close, and Mia's voice carrying through the ceiling in a question about the cardboard project. Isabella was standing at the counter with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup she hadn't filled yet. Her eyes were wet, plainly and without any attempt to manage it, which told him how far she'd come from the composed, controlled woman who had pressed her eyes dry in her kitchen 3 months ago and turned around steady. He crossed the kitchen and stood beside her, not dramatic about it, just present, which was the thing he knew how to do best. After a while, she said, "She's going to be okay." He thought about the word okay and what it actually contained, the years it would take to fully fill it, the work that wasn't done yet, and would require more time and patience and more imperfect days where the progress went sideways. He thought about what he knew about recovery from the inside, the thing nobody tells you, which is that it isn't a destination you get to and then rest. It's a practice, like anything that matters, something you keep doing in order to keep being it. Yeah, he said. She is. He reached over and held her hand on the counter, and she turned hers to hold his back, and they stood there while the kitchen went dark around them as the evening came in through the window, and neither of them moved to turn on a light for a long time, because neither of them needed one just yet. There is something worth saying about what happened in that house over 7 months, and it is this. Nothing that occurred was clean or certain or free of cost. Ethan Cole was not a hero, and he would reject the word if you offered it, because he understood that what he'd done was far simpler and less impressive than that designation implies. He'd sat down on a floor. He'd shown up on Tuesday and Thursday mornings and paid attention and not needed anything back, and let the time do what time does when it's given the right conditions. That was the whole catalog. But here's what's true underneath that simplicity. The ability to sit down on a floor next to someone suffering and not flinch, not fix, not make it about demonstrating your own capacity for empathy. That is not actually simple. Most people can't do it. Not because they don't care, but because care without an outlet for that care that has to just sit there and wait and trust the waiting, runs against everything in us that wants to act, to solve, to make the discomfort stop by doing something to it. Ethan had learned that patience the hard way, through experiences that had stripped away the easy responses and left only the difficult ones. He turned that toward Chloe not because he was exceptional, but because he had been broken in the specific ways that happened to align with what she needed. That alignment was not a plan. It was an accident of timing and one man's decision to drive the extra distance to a therapy center with better reviews. This is how it actually works, most of the time. Not through grand intentions and clearly marked paths, but through small contingent choices made without full information by people who are doing their best with what they have. Isabella Bennett had spent years believing that the right application of resources, money, specialists, programs, research, would be sufficient to reach her daughter. She had been wrong, and accepting that she was wrong had cost her more than any financial setback in her professional life, because it required dismantling a belief she'd built her identity around. That competence and effort, applied with sufficient intensity, could solve most things. Some things don't respond to intensity. Some things respond only to patience and presence, which are different operations entirely, and which require you to give up control in ways that feel, to a person like Isabella, almost physically difficult. She gave it up. Gradually and imperfectly and with backsliding, but she gave it up. That was its own kind of courage, the quieter kind that doesn't look like much from the outside. And Chloe, who had spent 2 years learning that calling out into silence was a cost with no return, and who had slowly, one increment at a time, revised that equation. Chloe was the proof that the thing people want most, underneath all the other things, is simply to be found. Not rescued, not fixed. Found. Seen, in the specific way that means, I looked and you were there and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. She'd been found in a waiting room. She'd done the finding too, which is the part that gets overlooked in these stories. She had looked at a man sitting on a floor and decided he was worth the risk of the blue pencil. She'd done that herself, out of what remained of the trust she hadn't entirely been able to eliminate even across 2 terrible years. The capacity had always been there. It just needed someone to sit still long enough for it to activate. In June, they got the dog. Mia's research had been thorough and ongoing for months, and the recommendation? A 3-year-old rescue mutt of indeterminate breed, from the county shelter, calm-tempered and already house-trained, was so well-sourced and logically presented that neither Ethan nor Isabella had found a genuine counter-argument. His name, per prior collective agreement, would be decided upon meeting him. They went on a Saturday, all 4 of them. The shelter was loud and warm and smelled like the industrial cleaning product that couldn't quite cover the smell underneath it. Mia went through the introduction process with the volunteers with the systematic approach of someone who had studied for this. Ethan filled out the paperwork. Isabella stood slightly back and let the girls do what they were going to do. Chloe was the one who found him. He was in the 3rd room, a brown and white dog of medium size with one ear that stood up and one that didn't, and he was sitting at the gate of his kennel with a patient, attentive expression, watching the people who came past with equitable interest. Not jumping, not demanding attention, just watching. Chloe stood in front of his kennel for a moment. The dog looked at her. His tail moved once. She put her fingers through the gate. He sniffed them and then rested his chin on them, gently, and just stayed there. "This one," she said. Nobody argued. He was in the car before anyone had formally agreed to anything, which was how it tended to go with significant decisions when all four of them were involved. The conclusion arrived before the deliberation finished, because the right answer was obvious enough that the discussion was mostly formality. Mia named him Copernicus on the drive home, citing his habit of watching everything in the room before moving, which she described as a scientist's quality. Chloe said Copernicus was a lot of name for a dog with one crooked ear. Mia said great names didn't have to match the container. Chloe thought about this and said fair, and Copernicus, in the back of the car between the girls, put his head on Chloe's knee and went to sleep. Ethan drove. Isabella was in the passenger seat. He could see the girls and the dog in the rearview mirror, and he didn't comment on what he was seeing because it didn't require comment. Some moments are complete in themselves. At a red light, Isabella reached over without preamble and put her hand on his arm, and he looked at her sidelong, and she wasn't looking at him. But she was smiling. The unguarded kind. The kind she'd stopped trying to manage. He put his hand over hers. The light changed, and he drove, and behind them Millhaven moved past the windows, and the dog slept in the back between the girls, and none of them knew exactly what the next year would look like, or how many more imperfect days would need to be sat through, or what forms the difficulty would take when it inevitably came again. They didn't know. Nobody ever does. What they had was the car, and the dog, and the road going forward, and each other. For now, that was everything.